A silent stone cross stands in a misty village square, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. These enigmatic monuments were once the center of every village across Europe. Yet their true purpose is a forgotten story. We will uncover the hidden history of these stone sentinels, revealing how they shaped faith, law, and daily life for generations. Why did every community need one? What secret powers did villagers believe they held? How much of our world was built around these weathered stones? What does it feel like to stand before a monument that witnessed 1,000 years of human drama? These stone crosses were not placed randomly on the outskirts of town. They anchored the village, physically and spiritually, at its very center. You would typically find one where the main paths crossed, in the market square, or on the common green where animals grazed. This was the busiest spot, the natural hub of all human activity. Think of it as the original town square, the medieval equivalent of a combined city hall, public bulletin board, and community church. It was the spot where life happened. People would gather here not just for prayer, but to hear news, to buy and sell goods, and to meet their neighbors. The cross was the silent witness to it all. A town crier would stand before it to announce new laws or proclamations from the local lord. A farmer might lean against its base while bargaining for a better price on his grain. Travelers would use it as a landmark, knowing that if they found the village cross, they had found the heart of the community. It was more than a monument. It was the beating heart of the village, a constant in a world of change, where faith and daily life were seamlessly woven together. But the stone cross was more than just a town center. Its placement was a deliberate act of transformation. In the early medieval period, when Christianity was still spreading across Europe, missionaries and local priests faced a profound challenge. The old beliefs, tied to ancient groves and sacred stones, were deeply rooted in the land. To convert a population, you had to convert its geography. So they built their crosses exactly where pagan holy sites once stood. A weathered menhir that had been a focus for druidic rituals might now have a Christian cross carved directly onto its surface. A clearing in the woods once sacred to a local deity would be cleared, and a new stone cross erected at its heart. This was spiritual conquest made visible. By placing the cross there, the church was not just building on pagan ground. It was absorbing the old power of the place, redirecting the villagers' innate sense of the sacred toward the new faith. The cross blessed the land, declaring it now under the protection of the Christian God. It marked a boundary, not just between fields, but between the old world and the new. Think of a traveler from that time, walking a familiar path. They would come to the old stone they knew held power, but now it bore a new symbol. The familiar feeling of awe was still there, but its meaning had been permanently shifted. The village was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a territory claimed by divine authority, a sanctuary defined by that single, silent sentinel of stone. This stone anchor of the community also served as its first open-air church. Before a village could muster the resources to build a grand stone chapel, the cross in the square was their primary place of worship. It was here that an itinerant monk, traveling from one settlement to the next, would gather the entire populace. He would stand with his back to the solid stone, facing the crowd assembled on the grass or the packed earth of the square. His voice would carry across the open space, explaining the scriptures and the core tenets of the faith to a people for whom these stories were still new. This was the preaching cross, a vital tool for spreading doctrine across the countryside. The setting itself was profoundly important. Unlike the later, often intimidating architecture of a church, this was worship in the light of day, accessible to everyone. There were no walls, no social barriers. The poorest farmer and the local landowner stood together in the same open space, united by the words spoken from the foot of the cross. It was here that basic sacraments were first administered to many. A priest might baptize a newborn, the water poured from a simple bowl, with the stone cross serving as the only altar. He might bless a marriage, joining two people in the heart of the community they would build their lives within. These crosses brought the sacred out of a distant building and planted it firmly in the center of daily life. Can you hear the echo of a sermon in that quiet village square? Can you see the faces of the villagers, listening intently to stories of a faith that was slowly weaving itself into the very fabric of their world. The stone cross was not just a symbol, it was an active participant, the very pulpit from which a new spiritual landscape was being spoken into existence. Away from the village center, these stone crosses took on a different but equally vital role. They stood as lonely waymarkers along winding tracks and desolate moors. For a merchant hauling his goods between towns or a pilgrim walking hundreds of miles to a holy shrine, these stone sentinels were more than just landmarks. They were a promise of safety and a confirmation of the path. In an age without signposts or accurate maps, a traveler's greatest fear was losing the way, especially as dusk began to fall. Spotting the familiar shape of a cross against the sky meant you were still on the right road. It was a moment of profound relief. Many of these waymarker crosses were inscribed with simple symbols or worn-down directions, perhaps a hand pointing toward the next village or a series of notches indicating the distance. They were the medieval equivalent of a modern road sign, offering crucial, potentially life-saving information. For the pilgrim, the cross was both a physical and spiritual guide. A journey to a distant cathedral could take weeks or even months, a test of faith and endurance. When a pilgrim reached a wayside cross, it was more than a chance to rest weary feet. It was a place for prayer and contemplation. They would kneel at its base, seeking strength for the next leg of their journey, offering thanks for safe passage thus far. The cross connected their personal, arduous trek to the larger tapestry of Christian devotion. It transformed a lonely path into a consecrated route, linking one sacred space to another. Think of a lone figure, cloak pulled tight against the wind, seeing that cross appear on the horizon. In that moment, it was not just a block of stone. It was a companion, a sanctuary, and a beacon of hope guiding them ever onward toward their distant goal. This stone pillar of faith also became a podium for the law. The broad base of the cross, or the worn steps leading up to it, served as the village's official platform for all matters of authority. When the king's messenger rode into town, it was here he would stand, unrolling a scroll to read a new royal decree in a clear, commanding voice. The entire village would be compelled to gather and listen, learning of a new tax, a declaration of war, or a change in the line of succession. But royal proclamations were only part of the story. The local manor court, presided over by the lord or his steward, would often convene right at the foot of the cross. This was where justice was meted out in public view. A dispute between two farmers over a strayed cow would be settled here. A baker accused of selling underweight loaves would face his accusers on this very spot. The cross was the silent witness to oaths sworn on the Bible, to fines levied, and to the resolution of conflicts that threatened the community's fragile peace. Its presence elevated these secular proceedings, lending them a weight of divine sanction. To speak an oath before the cross was to make a promise before God himself, making perjury a spiritual as well as a legal crime. Can you feel the tension in that crowded square? One villager steps onto the stone base, his voice trembling as he presents his case. Another stands below, arms crossed, listening intently. The entire community watches, their collective judgment forming the true court of opinion. This stone was more than a monument. It was the heart of the village's legal consciousness, the physical point where the authority of the manor and the crown met the daily lives of the people. It grounded the abstract concept of law in a place everyone knew and respected, ensuring that justice was not a distant idea, but a public ritual witnessed by all. Perhaps the most tangible power of the cross was felt on market day. A specific type of monument, the market cross, transformed the sacred symbol into a guarantee of honest commerce. Its soaring stone pinnacle was more than decoration. It cast a symbolic shadow over every transaction happening in the square, reminding every merchant and buyer that their dealings were watched by a higher authority. To cheat a neighbor was not just a crime against the community. It was a sin committed in the direct gaze of God, a violation of the sanctified ground on which they stood. This belief created a powerful incentive for fairness. A merchant knew that being caught selling short measure or rotten goods here, under the cross, would ruin his reputation far more completely than if he were caught elsewhere. The market cross effectively made the entire marketplace a sacred precinct, a place where your word and your weights had to be true. This sanctified space also provided very practical protection. The king's peace traditionally extended to the area around a market cross, making it a designated zone of safety for trade. This was crucial in a world where traveling merchants carried their wealth with them, and local farmers brought a season's worth of produce to sell. The cross offered a promise that disputes would be settled justly, and that violence or theft would be met with swift punishment. It was the medieval equivalent of a regulated exchange, a safe and orderly environment where commerce could flourish. A wool merchant from a distant city could unload his precious sacks here, confident that the local lord's authority, backed by the cross's spiritual weight, would protect his goods. And the cross itself was not a passive observer. Its wide, tiered steps became the most coveted stalls in the entire market. Bakers would spread their cloths on the warm stone, displaying loaves of fresh bread. Cheesemongers would arrange their rounds on the lower ledges. The steps provided a natural, elevated platform, making vendors visible to the entire crowd while keeping their wares clean and organized. Can you hear the lively chaos of such a day? The air thick with the smells of spices, livestock, and baking, the cacophony of haggling voices, the clink of coins. And rising above it all, the silent, weathered stone cross, a constant reminder that amidst the bustle and the bargaining, the community had agreed to conduct its business with a shared sense of honor and faith. These silent stone sentinels also drew the map of the world in 3 dimensions. A cross planted at the edge of a field or beside a country lane was far more than a simple marker. It was a legal document carved in stone, defining the precise boundary of a parish or the limit of a local lord's jurisdiction. To pass one of these stones was to cross an invisible but deeply significant line. You were moving from one territory into another, from one set of laws and obligations into a different one. The taxes you owed, the lord you answered to, even the priest who tended to your soul, all were determined by which side of that cross you called home. These boundary markers were so permanent, so unyielding, that they became the anchor points for a vital community ritual known as beating the bounds. Once a year, often on a religious feast day, the entire village would form a procession. The priest, the lord's bailiff, the constable, and every able-bodied man and boy would walk the entire perimeter of the parish. They would stop at each boundary cross, and here, the ceremony took a physical turn. Young boys might be lifted upside down, and their heads gently bumped against the stone. Older boys might be switched with willow wands upon their shoulders. This was not cruelty. It was a deliberate, multisensory act of memory-making. The sharp, startling sensation, the strange inversion of the world, the sting of the switch, all were designed to sear the location of that boundary permanently into a young mind. The community was ensuring that the knowledge of their territory would be carried in living memory, passed from one generation to the next through a shared, unforgettable experience. Can you see that long, ragged line of villagers winding their way across the landscape? They are not just walking. They are impressing a map upon the earth and upon their children, using ritual and stone to declare, for all time, this is where we belong. This is the edge of our world. These stone crosses also held the memory of the village, standing as permanent memorials to lives lived and lost. When a wealthy local landowner sought to secure his legacy, he might fund the carving and erection of a magnificent cross in the town square. This was not a simple act of vanity. It was a deeply calculated gesture, a public demonstration of piety and generosity meant to ensure his name would be remembered favorably by both his community and his God. The cross became his enduring mark on the world, a prayer in stone that would outlive him by centuries. But these memorials were not only for the powerful. Many a humble cross was raised by a grieving community to mark the tragic spot where a beloved priest or a respected elder had met an untimely end. These sites became spontaneous shrines, places for quiet reflection where the story of that person's life and death was whispered from one generation to the next. The stone served as a physical anchor for collective grief and remembrance. In times of great catastrophe, the cross took on its most somber role. When a plague swept through a village, leaving empty homes and shattered families in its wake, the survivors often commissioned a communal cross. This was not a memorial for a single person, but for dozens, sometimes hundreds of neighbors lost. It was a focal point for a community's shared trauma, a place to gather and mourn their unimaginable losses together. The names of the dead might not be carved into the stone, but everyone knew who it was for. It stood as a silent testament to their collective endurance, a declaration that the village, though wounded, would survive. Can you feel the weight of that shared sorrow, hardened into a single, stoic form? The cross became a stone ledger of local memory, its surface bearing witness not to words, but to the unspoken stories of an entire community's joys and tragedies. Beyond its roles in law and memory, the village cross was also a spiritual fortress. Medieval life was saturated with a fear of the unseen, a deep and abiding belief that malevolent forces constantly threatened the community. People saw the hand of witches in failing crops, the whisper of demons in sudden illnesses, and the presence of malevolent spirits in the deep shadows of the forest. Against this invisible siege, the stone cross stood as their primary defense. It was believed to possess a patripaic power, a special ability to turn away evil. The very symbol of the cross was thought to create a sacred zone of protection around it, a blessed barrier that demons and dark spirits could not cross. A mother worried about her sick child might bring a cloth to touch the base of the cross, hoping to imbue it with this protective energy to place upon the child's fevered brow. A farmer, fearing a witch's curse on his livestock, might drive his herd in a wide circle around the monument, trusting its power to cleanse them of any malign influence. This was not mere superstition. It was a core part of their worldview, a tangible way to combat the terrors of the night. The cross was their shield, a divine intervention made of stone, standing guard over the community's spiritual well-being. During times of plague, this role became even more critical. As a mysterious and devastating sickness swept through the village, the cross became a focal point for desperate prayers. Processions would wind their way from the church to the square, with priests leading the faithful in prayers for deliverance, begging for the cross power to push back the tide of death they could not understand. They believed the plague itself was a manifestation of divine wrath or demonic attack, and the cross was their strongest weapon against it. Can you sense the collective hope focused on that single point in the village? Every anxious glance, every whispered prayer, every trembling touch was an act of faith, reinforcing the idea that this stone sentinel was their active guardian. It was more than a symbol. It was a participant in a cosmic struggle, a bulwark against the chaos of the world, offering a profound sense of security in an age filled with very real fears. Each of these stone sentinels was a complex structure, a layered sculpture built to endure the ages. It all began with the base, the massive socle block that anchored the entire monument to the earth. This was not a simple slab. It was a deeply rooted foundation, often squared and heavy, designed to prevent the cross from shifting or sinking into the soft ground over centuries. Rising from this base were the steps, usually 3 in number. These tiers were far more than architectural features. They served as the platform for public speakers, the marketplace stalls for merchants, and the seats for weary travelers resting in the square. They physically and symbolically elevated the cross, lifting it above the mud and bustle of daily life, marking it as a focal point of supreme importance. From these steps soared the shaft, a single, tall column of stone that reached for the sky. This was the spine of the monument, hewn from a single block of local granite or sandstone. Its surface, though often worn smooth by wind and rain, might still show the faint traces of decorative carving, perhaps a vine pattern twisting upward or a series of geometric designs. About halfway up the shaft, you would often find the knob. This was a distinctive, bulbous swelling, a rounded knob of stone that acted as a visual break in the shaft's vertical line. Think of it as a piece of architectural punctuation, a deliberate pause that added both decorative elegance and structural strength to the design. And finally, crowning the entire structure, was the crosshead itself. This was the masterpiece, the part that held the most meaning and received the most intricate craftsmanship. Carved on its faces were stories in stone. One side might depict the crucifixion, a stark and powerful reminder of Christ's sacrifice, meant to inspire both piety and penance in all who looked upon it. The other side could feature a different scene entirely, perhaps a local saint to whom the village church was dedicated, or symbolic patterns like the sun, the moon, or the instruments of the Passion. These carvings were not just ornamentation. They were the Bible for an illiterate populace, a visual sermon frozen in stone, telling the foundational stories of their faith for everyone to see and understand. Can you picture the skill of the medieval mason, his chisel slowly bringing these sacred images to life from a block of rough stone? He was not just building a monument. He was creating the village's most important book, its law platform, and its spiritual compass, all fused into one enduring form. The stone cross was not a single, uniform design imposed across the continent. Its form shifted dramatically with the landscape and the local culture, creating a fascinating tapestry of regional styles. Journey to the windswept coasts of Ireland and Scotland, and you would encounter the monumental Celtic high cross. These were not just crosses. They were towering stone scriptures, massive rings of stone connecting the arms to the shaft, creating a powerful, almost wheel-like silhouette against the sky. Their surfaces were entirely covered with intricate carvings, a dense tapestry of knotted patterns, biblical scenes, and figures of saints. A single cross could tell the entire story of creation, the fall of man, and the sacrifice of Christ, all rendered in a complex visual language for a population that lived and breathed these stories. They were the great stone books of the Celtic Church, designed to inspire awe and devotion on a grand scale. Now, cross the sea to an English village green. Here, the preaching cross was often a more slender and functional structure. While still impressive, its design prioritized the practical need for a cleric to stand and address a crowd. The shaft was tall and sturdy, supporting a canopied top that sheltered the preacher from the rain. The carvings were often more reserved, focusing on the crucifixion or local saints, serving as a visual aid to the spoken sermon rather than a standalone narrative. The English cross was a pulpit first and a monument second, then traveled to the bustling market squares of France and Belgium. Here, the market cross evolved into something astonishingly ornate, almost like a miniature cathedral spire. These structures soared upward in multiple, delicate tiers, adorned with statues of the Virgin Mary, angels, and apostles nestled in carved niches. The cross at the very top was almost lost in a profusion of Gothic stonework, lace, and pinnacles. This was commerce sanctified by splendor, a statement of a town's wealth and piety meant to dazzle visiting merchants and assure them of the market's integrity. From the massive, story-covered monoliths of the Celtic world to the elegant pulpits of England and the flamboyant civic crowns of the continent, the stone cross adapted to its people. It reflected their artistic soul, their practical needs, and their deepest desire to build a sacred landmark that was uniquely, unmistakably, their own. Behind every weathered cross stood a master of stone, a craftsman whose name history has largely forgotten. These medieval stonemasons were not simple laborers. They were highly skilled artists, often organized into powerful guilds that guarded their trade secrets with fierce dedication. Their first task was to choose the right stone, and they always looked to the local landscape. In areas rich with granite, like the moors of Devon or the highlands of Scotland, they worked with that incredibly hard, durable stone, accepting its resistance to fine detail in exchange for a monument that could withstand 1,000 years of weather. In regions with softer sandstone or limestone, like parts of France and England, they had a more pliable canvas. This softer stone allowed for the intricate carvings of biblical scenes and the delicate tracery seen on market crosses. The stone itself dictated the character of the cross, a direct conversation between the craftsman and the land he worked in. The tools of his trade were simple, but required immense skill to wield effectively. His primary instruments were the pitcher, a heavy hammer used for roughing out the basic shape from the quarry block, and the mason's axe, with its broad, flat head for knocking off large chunks and creating a relatively smooth surface. For the fine work, the detail that brought saints and scriptures to life, he relied on a set of chisels. Each had a specific purpose. A claw chisel, with its toothed edge, was perfect for creating textured backgrounds and removing stone in controlled strips. A fine pointed chisel allowed him to incise delicate lines and define facial features or the intricate knots of a Celtic design. There were no power tools, no room for a significant error. Every strike of the mallet was a calculated risk, a permanent mark on the stone. The final polishing might be done with abrasives like sand or even a smooth river stone, painstakingly rubbing the surface to a soft sheen. Can you hear the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer and chisel echoing across the village square? The sound of a story being slowly coaxed from solid rock. His artistry was a unique blend of local tradition and wider influence. A mason in a remote Irish village would carve the same intricate knotwork his father and grandfather had taught him, patterns that were centuries old and deeply Celtic in spirit. Yet if a traveling monk brought a sketch of a new style from a cathedral in France, or if the local lord demanded a design he had seen on pilgrimage, the mason would absorb that influence. He might incorporate a more realistic depiction of the crucified Christ, a style emerging from the continent, onto a cross that otherwise followed the local form. The guild system ensured these skills and stylistic evolutions were passed down. A young boy would enter as an apprentice, spending years learning to sharpen tools, mix mortar, and perform simple tasks before ever touching a chisel to a fine block of stone. He would graduate to journeyman, traveling from one master to another, absorbing different regional techniques. Only after creating a masterpiece would he be judged worthy of the title Master Mason, allowing him to set up his own workshop and take on his own apprentices. This network of craftsmen created a fascinating map of styles. You can trace the routes of trade and pilgrimage not through documents, but through the flowing lines and carved figures on these silent stone sentinels, each one a testament to the anonymous hand that shaped it. The worn stone steps of the village cross created a rare and powerful social arena. In a world rigidly divided by class, this was one of the few places where the entire community, from the highest to the lowest, was compelled to gather. The lord of the manor would stand near the base, his fine wool tunic setting him apart, to hear a royal proclamation that applied to him as much as to the serf standing a few feet away. That serf, clad in coarse homespun, would be there for the same announcement, his life equally bound by the new law. For a few moments, their different worlds converged on common ground, forced to acknowledge their shared existence within the same small universe of the village. The cross did not erase the hierarchy, but it made it visible and undeniable, compressing the entire social structure into a single, crowded square. This created a unique form of social glue. The local blacksmith, a free man of some means, would rub shoulders with a bonded plowman who owed his labor to the lord. The miller's wife, often viewed with suspicion for her family's relative wealth, would stand beside the wife of a thatcher, both of them listening to the same sermon. They might not speak as equals in the fields or at the manor hall, but here, at the foot of the cross, they participated in the same rituals, heard the same news, and felt the same sense of belonging to a place. This shared experience fostered a fragile but essential community identity. The village needed its lord for protection and justice, and the lord needed his villagers for labor and sustenance. The cross was the physical point where this interdependent relationship was publicly performed and reinforced. It was the stage upon which the community saw itself as a whole, a complex organism where every person, regardless of station, had a role to play. Can you feel the unspoken tension and the quiet recognition in that crowded space? 100 different lives, each with its own burdens and joys, all momentarily united by the simple, profound fact of their shared presence before the stone sentinel that watched over them all. For a soul burdened by sin, the stone cross offered a path to redemption. Before a long pilgrimage or an act of solemn penance, the journey did not start on the open road. It began here, in the heart of the village, at the foot of this familiar monument. A man or woman seeking to atone for a transgression would kneel on the cold stone steps, the entire community potentially looking on. The local priest would stand before them, placing a hand on their shoulder and offering a blessing for their arduous undertaking. This public ritual was profoundly important. It transformed a private spiritual struggle into a communal event. The villagers witnessing this were not just spectators. They became participants in a collective act of mercy, their silent presence a form of support and a reminder of the forgiveness the penitent hoped to find. The cross was the spiritual launchpad, the point of departure from the ordinary world into a sacred quest. After the blessing, the pilgrim would rise, often touch the base of the cross one final time for strength, and then turn to walk away, leaving the safety of the known world behind. With each step, the silhouette of the cross would grow smaller, but its symbolic weight would travel with them. It connected their lonely, individual journey to the vast network of Christendom. That same symbol would guide them to the next wayside cross on a desolate hill, and the next, creating a chain of faith that led all the way to the great cathedrals of Rome, Canterbury, or Santiago de Compostela. Can you feel the immense courage that moment required? To walk away from everything familiar, guided only by faith and the memory of that stone sentinel in your home village. This ritual tied the most local of places to the grandest of spiritual geographies. A humble farmer from an English village, by starting his journey at that cross, was physically connecting his home to the holy shrines of Europe. He was a living thread weaving his small community into the immense tapestry of the medieval Christian world. The cross was both his starting line and the anchor he carried in his heart, a piece of home that made the whole wide, frightening world feel a little less empty. Yet this entire world of stone and faith was about to be shattered. The Reformation swept across Europe like a spiritual hurricane, and its winds of change were not gentle. For the Protestant reformers, these village crosses were not sacred symbols. They were idols, objects of superstitious worship that stood between the faithful and a direct relationship with God. In their zealous eyes, the crosses had to be purged. Mobs, sometimes led by radical preachers, descended upon town squares. They attacked the monuments with hammers and chisels, focusing their fury on the most ornate parts. The carved figure of Christ on the cross was often the first to be defaced, his features smashed beyond recognition. The statues of saints nestled in the niches of a market cross were toppled and broken. This was iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of religious images, and it was a violent rejection of the visual culture that had defined medieval life for centuries. The goal was not just to break stone, but to break a mindset, to tear down the physical anchors of the old religion and force a new, more austere form of worship upon the populace. Can you hear the sound of metal striking stone, the cheers of the mob, the silent horror of the villagers watching their spiritual compass being systematically dismantled? The destruction was often methodical. A market cross, once a crown of the town, might be stripped of all its statues, leaving behind empty, scarred niches. A preaching cross might be reduced to a simple, unadorned shaft, its carved sermons erased. In some places, the entire structure was pulled down, the stone broken up and carted away to be used as mere building material, its sacred history forgotten. But not every cross met this fate. Why did some survive the storm? Location was often the key to salvation. A cross standing in a prominent city square was a prime target for reformers. But one tucked away in a remote hamlet, or on a lonely moor far from the centers of power, might simply be overlooked. The fervor for destruction was concentrated in urban areas, and many rural crosses survived simply because nobody with a hammer bothered to make the journey. Other crosses were saved by a different kind of transformation. In a pragmatic act of preservation, communities sometimes repurposed their crosses, stripping them of their explicitly Catholic identity. A cross head might be removed from the shaft, and the stone pillar turned into a simple market pillar or a boundary marker. Its original function erased, but its stone body preserved. Some were simply forgotten, swallowed by ivy in a quiet churchyard, or slowly sinking into the soil of a field, their stories fading from memory until they were just anonymous lumps of stone. These survivors are the silent witnesses to a cataclysmic shift in history. They stand today with their scars visible, their missing limbs telling a story of faith, fury, and the fragile nature of the symbols we hold sacred. Beyond their official duties, these stone crosses became the pillars of local folklore, gathering stories as moss gathers on their weathered surfaces. Villagers wove tales of miracles and mysteries directly into the stone, creating a rich tapestry of popular belief that often held more power than any written doctrine. A cross standing at a lonely crossroads might be known as the spot where a ghostly monk appeared each full moon. forever pacing and praying for a sin he could not absolve. Another, in a secluded valley, was said to mark the grave of a giant from a time before memory. Its immense size explained by the sheer scale of the stone monument raised over its resting place. In Wales, the famous Cross of Nevern is said to bleed, its stone slowly weeping a reddish mineral deposit that locals long believed was the blood of a wrongfully executed man, a permanent stain of injustice on the holy symbol. These were not just spooky stories told to frighten children. They were a way for the community to explain the unexplainable, to claim their landscape as a place of wonder and significance. A cross that stood where a spring suddenly burst forth during a drought became the site of a miracle, its water forever after considered blessed with healing properties. A mother who recovered her lost child near a particular wayside cross would tell the story for generations, and the cross would thereafter be known as a protector of the young. The stones absorbed these human dramas, becoming characters in an ever-evolving oral history. Can you feel the weight of those unrecorded stories pressing against the stone? Each strange marking became a clue, each unusual placement a puzzle. A cross leaning at a sharp angle was not just sinking into the soft earth. The villagers knew it leaned because it had bowed its head in grief on the day Christ was crucified. Another cross, found with a worn hole near its base, was not simply the result of erosion. It was the ear of the cross, a place where you could whisper your deepest secrets and be heard by heaven itself. These legends gave the people a sense of ownership and intimacy with the monuments that governed their lives. They transformed cold, impersonal law and doctrine into something alive, responsive, and deeply woven into the very soil beneath their feet. When pestilence stalked the land, the stone cross became the heart of a community's defiance. The Black Death did not just bring physical suffering. It unleashed a tide of terror and confusion, a feeling that the world itself was unraveling. In this overwhelming darkness, the village cross was a fixed point, a place to grasp for hope. Desperate processions would form, winding their way from the church doors to the square. Led by priests chanting prayers and swinging censers of smoking incense, the entire surviving population would follow, their faces pale with fear. They would gather around the cross, kneeling on the ground, their voices rising in a unified plea for divine mercy. They believed the cross' sacred power could create a barrier, a spiritual cordon sanitaire against the invisible miasma of disease. It was their collective shield raised against the unknown. This was not a quiet, private faith. It was a public, visceral cry for deliverance, a ritual of shared vulnerability that bound the living together in the face of indiscriminate death. The cross also became a grim center for charity. As families were wiped out or confined to their homes by sickness, the base of the monument transformed into a distribution point. Those who were still healthy would leave loaves of bread or pots of simple broth on the wide stone steps for the sick and the destitute to collect. A wealthy merchant, seeking to atone for his sins in the face of judgment, might fund the purchase of medicine, with the remedies being handed out at the cross by the parish priest. This was practical faith in action. The sanctified ground ensured the alms were given and received under God's watchful eye, discouraging the greed and hoarding that could erupt in such crises. Can you feel the raw, desperate hope in that crowded square? The air thick with the smell of herbs burned to purify the air, the sound of weeping mingling with the murmured prayers, the sight of a neighbor leaving food for a family they may never see again. In these moments of absolute despair, the stone cross was more than a symbol. It was the community's anchor, the one thing that did not change when everything else was falling apart. It offered a script for how to behave when all other rules had vanished: to pray, to give, to come together. It was the solid, enduring proof that even in the shadow of the grave, there was still a community, and they would not face the darkness alone. The rough stone cross of the 10th century was a stark, functional tool. Its form was simple, little more than a roughly shaped shaft and crossarm, its purpose purely utilitarian. It was a preaching platform, a law stone, a boundary marker. But as the centuries turned, something remarkable began to happen. The slow accumulation of wealth and stability in the later Middle Ages transformed these humble monuments. Prosperous villages and growing towns no longer saw the cross as merely a tool. It became a canvas, a statement of civic pride and personal piety. its form evolving from the purely functional to the breathtakingly ornamental. This evolution is etched in stone, a visible timeline of a community's journey from mere survival to self-expression. In the early days, a village was lucky to have any stone monument at all. The priority was its presence, not its decoration. The cross needed to be sturdy, visible, and able to withstand the elements. It was an object of necessity. Its power derived from its function and its sacred symbol, not from its artistic merit. But as trade routes stabilized and agricultural techniques improved, surplus wealth began to flow into communities. A successful wool trade in England, or thriving vineyards in France, meant a village had more than enough to meet its basic needs. This new prosperity was often channeled directly into the most public of possessions, the village cross. It was the town's centerpiece, and a plain, functional cross began to seem unworthy of a thriving community's status. The first signs of this change were subtle. A local lord, grateful for a good harvest or returned safely from a pilgrimage, might pay for a new cross to replace the old, worn one. This new version might feature a simple decorative pattern carved around the base of the shaft, or a more finely shaped crosshead. This was not just a replacement. It was an upgrade, a physical manifestation of gratitude and growing confidence. Then came the true flourishing. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the village cross in a wealthy town was often a masterwork of stone masonry. The simple shaft was replaced by an intricately carved pillar, perhaps featuring figures of the 12 apostles standing in niches, their faces and robes rendered with delicate care. The functional steps at the base multiplied into a grand, tiered platform, inviting the community to sit and gather. Most spectacular of all was the crowning glory, the crosshead itself. In many late medieval market crosses, the simple cross was encased within a soaring, ornate canopy, a miniature stone spire bristling with pinnacles and finials that reached for the sky. Look at the famous market cross at Chichester or Malmesbury in England. They are not simple crosses. They are elaborate, multi-storied structures, more akin to delicate stone lanterns than the stark monuments of earlier centuries. They were designed to inspire awe, to announce to every visitor that this was a town of importance, a place of wealth and devout faith. The same sacred symbol that once served as a simple pulpit was now a piece of civic jewelry, a declaration that the community had arrived. This was art in the service of faith and community, a silent but powerful sermon in stone about the blessings of peace and prosperity. The village cross had completed its journey, transforming from a tool of survival into a lasting legacy of beauty. The silent stones have kept their secrets for centuries, but modern archaeology is finally listening. Ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation around ancient village crosses are revealing a history far older and more complex than the monuments themselves suggest. In a quiet English village, archaeologists recently peeled back the turf around the base of a medieval stone cross. They expected to find its original foundation. What they discovered instead was the dark, rich stain of rotted wood, the clear outline of a post hole that had once held a much earlier, simpler wooden cross. This was profound evidence. The stone sentinel we see today was not the first of its kind. It was a replacement, a permanent upgrade for a humble wooden original that had likely stood for generations, marking the sacred spot long before the community could afford the skill and expense of stone. This finding rewrites the timeline of these villages, pushing their formal Christian identity back by hundreds of years. Even more telling are the small objects found nestled in the soil at the foot of these crosses. In several locations, painstaking sifting has uncovered collections of medieval silver pennies, a single button, a worn thimble, or a tiny, crudely carved toy. These were not lost items. They were deliberate deposits, hidden offerings left by villagers seeking favor, giving thanks, or perhaps attempting to bind a promise. A merchant about to embark on a risky trading journey might bury a coin, a physical prayer for safe passage and profit. A young woman might leave a simple token, a silent plea for a happy marriage or a healthy child. These acts transformed the cross from a public monument into a personal conduit to the divine, a sacred wishing well made of stone. The most startling discoveries, however, reach back even further, into the shadows of the pre-Christian world. Excavations around a well-known cross in Cornwall revealed not Christian offerings, but a deposit of carefully arranged animal bones and fragments of distinctive pottery from the Iron Age. The stone cross, it turned out, had been erected directly over a site used for pagan rituals over 1,000 years earlier. This was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate, powerful continuation. The early church understood that the human need for a sacred center was older than any one faith. By building their cross on that exact spot, they were harnessing a deep, primal sense of holiness that had drawn people to that place for millennia. The cross did not erase the old ways. It absorbed them, layering a new story atop a much older one, and in doing so, it gave the new faith roots that reached into the very bedrock of the land. These archaeological whispers tell a story of continuous veneration, a thread of human belief that connects the modern era to the distant pagan past, all focused on a single, enduring point in the landscape. But the cross in the bustling square was not the only one. A quieter, yet equally important, sentinel stood just a short walk away within the hallowed ground of the churchyard. While the village cross thrived on public life, the churchyard cross was a creature of the sacred enclosure, its purpose more tightly bound to the rituals of the church itself. Its location made all the difference. Erected on ground consecrated by a bishop, it existed within a spiritual bubble, a space formally separated from the secular world. This was not the place for a merchant to haggle or a bailiff to hold court. Its primary audience was the congregation, and its functions were deeply liturgical. One of its most vivid roles came during Palm Sunday ceremonies. On this day, the entire parish would gather outside the church doors, often around the churchyard cross. The priest would bless branches of palm or, in their absence, local greenery like willow or yew. The congregation would then process, carrying these blessed branches, circling the church or moving through the churchyard, finally entering the church for Mass. The cross served as the focal point for this reenactment of Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, physically placing the villagers into the biblical story right in their own community. It was also a vital preaching aid. Before the Sunday service, or on feast days when the church was too crowded, the priest might stand with his back to the churchyard cross to deliver his sermon to those assembled in the open air. The cross behind him lent divine authority to his words, much like the village cross did for a town crier. But here the message was purely spiritual, divorced from the proclamations of lords and the disputes of the marketplace. Yet the line between these two crosses could sometimes blur in fascinating ways. In a small, poor village that had not yet built a substantial church, the churchyard cross might be the only permanent stone structure, forcing it to take on some of the public roles of its village square cousin. Conversely, in a large, prosperous town, the elaborate market cross might be so ornate that it felt more like a piece of the church, transplanted into the commercial heart of the community. Their distinct purposes, however, remained clear. One cross was for the world, a hub of law, commerce, and news. The other was for the soul, a guide for processions, a backdrop for sermons, and a marker of the formal boundary between the secular and the divine. One managed the life of the village, while the other prepared its people for the life to come. That ancient stone witness, having survived Reformation and plague, now faces a quieter, more insidious threat. The same wind and rain that smoothed its surface for centuries now carry a new danger, the subtle acid of modern pollution, which slowly eats away at the delicate carvings that tell its story. The fight to save these monuments is a race against time, a complex blend of science, craftsmanship, and a deep respect for the past. The first challenge is simply diagnosing the patient. Conservators begin with meticulous surveys, using high-resolution photography and laser scanning to create a digital twin of the cross. This precise model reveals hairline cracks, areas of erosion, and the slow, gravitational creep that threatens to topple the entire structure over decades. They analyze the stone itself, identifying its mineral composition and how it reacts to freeze-thaw cycles that can shatter it from within. Only with this intimate understanding can the delicate work of restoration begin. The goal is never to make the cross look new. A power washer would be an act of violence, stripping away the precious patina of age. Instead, conservators work with surgical precision. They might inject a colorless, breathable lime-based grout into hidden fissures to stabilize the core. To repair a damaged carving, they use a mortar mixed with stone dust that matches the original, carefully filling losses without obscuring the surviving details. Sometimes the most heroic act is invisible. A cross sinking into soft ground might be carefully lifted, its foundations reinforced with stainless steel pins before it is set back upon a new, stable base, ready to face another 500 years. But the natural world is only one enemy. The modern scourge of vandalism, whether from mindless graffiti or deliberate theft, inflicts wounds far faster than time. This is where community becomes the cross's greatest guardian. Local historical societies often adopt their village cross, raising funds for its care and monitoring its condition. School children learn its stories, forging a personal connection that turns them into its future protectors. These stones are not relics in a museum. They are living history in our public squares, and their survival depends on us seeing them not as forgotten ornaments, but as neighbors. Why does this painstaking effort matter? Because these crosses are a unique, irreplaceable library. Their stones hold the signature of the medieval climate in their weathered surfaces. Their carvings are a record of artistic styles, trade routes, and theological shifts. The very lichens growing on them can tell scientists about centuries of air quality. They are three-dimensional archives, and once a carving is worn to nothing or a stone is stolen for a garden wall, that chapter of our shared story is lost forever. To stand beside a newly conserved cross is to feel a connection across the gulf of time. You can once again trace the lines of a saint's robe, read the sorrow in a crucifixion scene, or feel the smooth dip in the step worn by countless generations of villagers. This is not just about preserving stone. It is about safeguarding the physical anchors of our collective memory, ensuring that future generations can still stand in the shadow of these silent sentinels and hear their ancient, whispering stories. Centuries after their creation, these stone crosses began to migrate from the village square into the pages of books and the frames of paintings. The first artists to capture their likeness were the anonymous monks, hunched over illuminated manuscripts. In the margins of prayer books and psalters, they painted delicate scenes of daily life, and there, nestled among the biblical figures, was the familiar form of the village cross. It appears as a simple backdrop for a baptism, a meeting point for travelers, or the central landmark in a miniature map of a town. These were not grand artistic statements. They were quiet, faithful recordings of a world the artists knew intimately, ensuring the cross was remembered not just as a symbol, but as a lived reality. This humble documentation, however, would transform dramatically centuries later. When the Romantic movement swept across Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, artists and writers looked back at the Middle Ages not as a time of hardship, but as an age of profound faith and rustic simplicity. They saw in the weathered village cross the perfect emblem for this lost idyllic world. In the paintings of artists like Samuel Palmer, the cross is no longer just a stone structure. It is bathed in a soft, golden twilight, often surrounded by pious peasants or shepherds tending their flocks. The carving is deliberately softened, the edges blurred by time and nostalgia. This was not a strictly historical depiction. It was an emotional one, a symbol of an enduring, unchanging faith that stood in stark contrast to the smoky, disruptive factories of the Industrial Revolution. The cross became a tranquil anchor in a world that seemed to be spinning too fast. Romantic poets like William Wordsworth further cemented this image. In his poems, a lonely wayside cross on a windswept moor is not a mere guidepost. It is a touchstone for spiritual reflection, a place where the weary modern soul could connect with the timeless and the divine. The rough, lichen-covered stone was celebrated for its age and its silent endurance. This artistic and literary reinvention was incredibly powerful. It effectively created the medieval village of our collective imagination, a peaceful, devout community gathered around its ancient cross. We have inherited this romantic vision, and it colors how we see these monuments even today. When we look at a village cross now, we are not just seeing a medieval artifact. We are seeing it through the soft focus lens of the Romantics, who taught us to value it as a symbol of a simpler, more spiritually grounded past. Their art and poetry did more than preserve the cross's image. They gave it a new soul, one that continues to draw us toward these silent stones, searching for the peace and permanence they were made to represent. Its dominance began to wane as the world around it shifted on its axis. The village cross was a creation of a decentralized, local world, and as power began to consolidate in the hands of kings and national governments, its role as a legal podium became redundant. Why listen to a proclamation read by a Lord's bailiff at the cross when the king's justices now held regular assizes in a nearby town, dispensing a uniform law from a proper courthouse? The authority that once resided in the public square was slowly drawn upward and inward into buildings dedicated solely to governance. At the same time, the very spiritual landscape transformed. For centuries, the preaching cross served as the primary church for many communities. But as villages grew more prosperous, they poured their resources and pride into constructing permanent stone churches. These magnificent buildings, with their enclosed naves and consecrated altars, offered a new kind of sacred space. Worship moved from the open air, with its distractions and weather, into a controlled, awe-inspiring environment that emphasized the majesty and mystery of God. The open-air pulpit of the cross was no longer the center of religious life. It was, at best, a relic of a more rustic past, a time before the community could afford a true house of God. The single most violent blow, of course, was the Reformation. The theological earthquake that split the church in two did not just question the cross. It condemned it as a graven image, an idol that tempted people into superstition. In regions that turned Protestant, the destruction was swift and systematic. The very symbol that had anchored the village was now seen as a dangerous corruption, and its public functions were stripped away along with its carved saints. But even in places untouched by iconoclasm, a quieter revolution was underway. The medieval economy, built on local lords and communal farming, was giving way to new systems. Enclosure acts privatized the common lands where the cross often stood. The rise of a cash economy and a merchant class meant social interactions were no longer centered on the manorial court or the communal market in the square. A person's identity became less about their place in the village and more about their trade or their personal wealth. The cross, which had thrived as the heart of a tightly knit, interdependent community, now stood in a world where such communities were slowly unraveling. Its purpose had been woven from many threads: law, faith, commerce, and society. One by one, those threads were cut until the great stone sentinel was left standing in the square. A powerful and beautiful monument, but a monument to a way of life that was already fading into memory. That stone sentinel in the square was never just one thing. It was the village's soul, a single point where faith, law, commerce, and community converge. It was the open-air pulpit where a new religion took root, the law stone where oaths were sworn and justice was publicly witnessed, and the market cross that sanctified honest trade. It drew the map of the parish with its boundary markers and offered a spiritual shield against the terrors of plague and the unseen dark. For generations, every facet of life revolved around this silent witness. Its weathered surface is a testament to 1,000 forgotten dramas, 1,000 quiet prayers, and the shared identity of an entire world. These crosses are our most direct link to the medieval mind. They do not speak of kings and epic battles, but of the humble, daily realities of our ancestors. They tell us what they feared, what they valued, and how they built a world of meaning around a simple block of stone. They embody their longing for order in a chaotic world, for protection from forces they could not control, and for a sacred center in their own community. So the next time your travels take you through an old village, or you pass a worn stone cross in a field, pause for a moment, look past the weathered surface and the silence. See the market bustling at its base, hear the town crier's voice ringing out with news, feel the hope of a pilgrim setting forth. That stone is not a relic. It is a doorway, and if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of the world it once anchored.